2012 model F250. I'm replacing the transmission on it. I wanted to give you guys a heads up on what's involved in removing it. This one was a 4x4, so we had to remove the transfer case. In order to remove the transfer case, you have to loosen the 6 bolts on the drive shaft that goes to the front differential, which is this one here. It has 6 bolts in the front, 6 bolts in the back. We took it loose from the transfer case right here. We unplugged the servo motor for the 4x4. We removed the drive shaft that goes to the back. It has 4 bolts on it. We went ahead and removed the catalytic converter bolts at the top, 2 15mm nuts. On the passenger side, 2 15mm nuts. On the transmission, you have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bolts. Let's say 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 bolts. And 3 on the starter. This one had a broken off bolt on the starter. You have 4 nuts on the torque converter. On the driver's side, you have a 10mm bolt that holds the cooler lines. You have 2 10mm bolts that hold the shifter cable. On the back of the transmission, you have the bolts that hold the transfer case in place. As you notice, this one broke off, it's really bent. These are made out of aluminum. Overall, bad idea to have aluminum bolts, but anyways, a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 bolts. Actually, 9 bolts. Let's see, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This here is a guide pin that basically lines up the transfer case in its place. On this side, you have the connector for the transmission. There were a couple of plastic clips that hold the harness in place. There was a 15mm bolt right here holding a bracket. The purpose of the bracket is it holds the gas lines and the evap lines. So basically 1 bolt, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The size of the bolts. This is the bolt. This is the size of the bolts that hold the transmission. 13mm head. Transfer case bolts look like this. Inverted torques. On the torque converter, 21mm on the crankshaft to spin it. And then you have the access hole up here. Let me get a clear view of that. There's the access hole. 15mm on those bolts. This is the main connector for the transmission. You spin it and it pops out. I unplugged the oxygen sensors. I actually had to remove the oxygen sensor downstream on the passenger side for clearance. The mount had to be removed. This one's a little bit finicky. It actually came off with exhaust. The bolts are kind of hard to access. It's got 4 bolts that hold on to the back of the transfer case underneath. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward. There's 2 10mm bolts on these heat shields and 4 large bolts on this part right here, the transmission cross member. The drive shaft slides out of the torque it slides out of the transfer case. It has a plate at the bottom, the transmission does, with two 13mm bolts. Not too bad. These two bolts at the top are kind of a pain. There's a bracket on this bolt right here that holds the transmission cooler lines. I believe there's another bracket up here for the fuel lines. This bracket. And then this is the other bracket that goes on the side on that bolt. I loosened the exhaust right after the catalytics, after the Y pipe. And then it came down. All right, I'm gonna be going back together with it now. Like and subscribe. 2011 model F150 with a 6.2 liter. Swapping out the transmission on it. I just got the transmission stabbed. I wanted to touch base on the bolts, hardware lines, and harnesses that hold it. So we have one 15, it's a 13mm bolt here, another one here, another one here. Right there's another one. Let me see if I can focus on it. That one right there with the bracket. That bracket holds the lines, these three lines, fuel and evap lines. There's another bolt over there, 13mm at the very top. This is on the driver's side. We have two 10mm bolts that hold the bracket for the shifter. This shifter cable is in bad condition, is missing the bushing. We have the two cooler lines with a 10mm bolt. I have the exhaust removed still. I haven't installed the transfer case, so we don't have the drive shaft for the front installed just yet. There is another bracket right here at the back with a 15mm bolt. The purpose of the bracket is to hold the three lines, the two fuel lines and the evap line, and the harness for the oxygen sensors. You have both connectors right here. This little bracket right here is for the hose that goes to the breather on the transfer case. On the driver's side, you have the main plug for the transmission. This one, all you have to do is twist it and pull it out. And to install it is the opposite. You push it and you twist down, and that's how it locks. There's two plastic clips that hold the harness in place. And on this truck, the transmission harness comes down right on top of the exhaust manifold. It had a clip from the factory that held up the wiring up above the harness, above the exhaust manifold I'm in. And that clip was broken, so I added some extra heat shield insulation with some zip ties, and I zip tied the entire harness above the manifold to where it doesn't get burnt. There is another 13mm bolt right here that holds the transmission, and another one here with a bracket that holds the lines for the oil cooler. The starter goes on these three holes. I still have to put it on. It goes in that hole right there. And then I still have to put the nuts for the torque converter. I'm gonna back up a little bit so you guys can get a sense of where this is at. This is the front of the vehicle. Here we have the front differential. This is the oil pan for the engine. And then in this area, we have the access hole for the torque converter bolts. So what you do is you put them on one at a time, and you spin the engine over from the crank pulley in order to be able to put those on one at a time. This one's kind of tight, but it's doable. It's 4 of them total. I'm gonna make some more progress on this and I'll update as we go. It's not a step-by-step video, but at least it gives you a clear understanding of what holds it and how it goes together, where the wiring harnesses go. Let me see if I can get some good light up here. You can see the 1 bolt with the bracket. It's very limited space here to see anything, honestly, but you get the idea. So next we have to install the transfer case. It bolts to the back of the transmission. This here is a guide pin, and then we have 9 bolts that hold it in place. We'll do that next. So here we have the transfer case going onto the transmission. You can see the bolts, they're loose. We're tightening them. This one here is different because one of them broke. I found a replacement that's very similar, just the head's different. Threads on, no issues. It's a couple of bolts at the top.
Whenever it gets tight, I'm stopping, okay, bro?
That's good. You gotta be ever so careful with these aluminum bolts. One of them broke when we took it apart, so you definitely don't want to over torque them because they'll definitely break. There is a lot of power being transferred from the transmission to the transfer case, so they can be loose, but you can't overdo it. Maybe we should look up the torque spec and torque them. So on the transfer case, we basically have this one connector, and we have the breather hose. Other than that, we just have to put the drive shaft in the front, drive shaft in the back, then the exhaust, the Y pipe, there's a couple of clips that hold the wiring harness in place. And that's really it for the transfer case. So here we are making some progress on this transmission job. It will be very ideal to change the filter and the gasket on the pan prior to installing the mount and the transmission bracket that goes right here in the back, because once that is installed, you're gonna have a hard time removing the bolts in the back of the transmission. So basically, you have to make sure you remove the old gasket or the grommet that goes on the filter, so that the filter goes on there properly. This here is the old one. The filter literally pushes up in that hole,
and it sits.
and that's it. It just sits there. Once you put the pan back in place, it'll hold the filter because it has a tendency of drooping. Other than that, once we put the pan back on, I can put the bracket that holds the weight of the transmission on the mount. It's a good time to clean the pan, make sure it's nice and clean. Let's make some more progress and I'll keep updating. Another thing that's very important and worth mentioning is that on this model transmission, you 100% have to program the transmission to the vehicle, otherwise it will not shift right. So the number that you're looking for is this one right here. Each individual transmission is gonna have a different number, and that number gets programmed on the ECM of the vehicle, otherwise it will not shift properly. There's different numbers on these shift solenoids, and that is the strategy number that's used to be able to program that valve body. Make sure you clean this properly, get rid of any metal shavings, clean the magnet. I'll show you guys how to fill the transmission. You do it through this plug right here. You have a small dipstick that tells you the level. I'll show that later on the video on how to properly fill it. You have to do it while the vehicle is running. All right, so videoing how to tighten the bolt is very difficult because there's very little room, but there you can get a glimpse of how the impact sits once you have it situated on the bolt with a swivel socket. I mean, you guys know what the sound of an impact, so that's exactly how the impact has to go, and you barely have enough room to get your hand in there and tighten it. That's basically how you tighten it, and you spin the motor and you do that 4 times to tighten all 4 of them. All right guys, so here's the finished product. I'm sorry I didn't do it step by step. Sometimes with these jobs you get carried away. We just got through filling up the transmission with fluid. You can see the little plastic dipstick right there. It looks exactly like the one I'm holding in my hand. There are 2 marks on this dipstick. Let me see if I can get a clear shot of it. A and B. So when the transmission is cold, it should be on the A range. Once it's full, it should be on the B range. You check it with the transmission, the vehicle running. It must be in park or neutral. So like I said, A for cold, B for hot. With the vehicle running, you fill it up through this port right here, and it has a cap that looks exactly like this one, which has a O-ring on it. And what that does, I'm gonna try not to burn myself because the catalytic converter is hotter than hell. Basically, that's where that plug goes. It's 19 millimeter in size. We're gonna go ahead and tighten it. I'm gonna show on the old transmission we removed what I'm talking about, but basically that's how you check and fill the fluid on this transmission. There's no dipstick. So we have the dipstick right here. This is the transmission that we took off the vehicle. This is the hole where you fill it from, and this fits in here like so. So with it running, it sits in there like that. You have the vehicle running, you add fluid to it, and you'll be able to tell how much fluid you got in it. It should be on the A range when it's cold, and on the B range when it's hot. This port is located on the passenger side. Just be really careful when you do it so you don't burn yourself. Good luck, like and subscribe.